Today, I'm Kate Seeley, Vice President of the Middle East Institute. We'll be examining Russia's support of the Assad regime in the face of mounting international pressure and criticism. To date, Russia has vetoed 2 draft Security Council resolutions in the past 5 months seeking to hold Assad accountable and support a political transition. The Russians say they're opposed to what they call geopolitical engineering. And in the meantime, as we see, the deaths are mounting, the chaos is mounting, and yet the Russians appear as committed as ever to backing the Assad horse with the support of the Chinese. And today, Mark Katz is going to be examining the many calculations that the Russians are considering. When I actually had the privilege of living in Syria as a young girl in the 80s. My father was in the embassy, and at that time, Hafez al-Assad had many, of course, Russian military advisors who used to drive around, not in Ladas, but in white Range Rovers, which made them very easy targets for the Muslim Brotherhood, which was, of course, waging a rebellion against the regime at the time. And several were killed. Mark and I were talking about this today. We don't know how many. The Russians never disclosed the numbers, but it's fascinating that 30 years later, these 2 allies are still together, facing down together a somewhat similar threat, possibly referring to the same playbook, and certainly sharing the same history. United, well, not just in their isolation, but in this shared history as well. So it's a deep and complex relationship, and one that we're very much looking forward to understanding better today. Mark Katz has been examining Russia's relations with the Middle East for many years now. He's a professor of government and politics at George Mason University, and has been working on this topic for 30 years. He's the author of Leaving Without Losing, The War on Terror After Iraq and Afghanistan, Reflections on Revolutions and Revolutionary Waves, and Russia and Arabia, Soviet Foreign Policy Toward the Arabian Peninsula, among others. He has a website, markkatz.com, where you can read more of his articles and find out more about his books. We're very honored and pleased to have him here today to fill us in on this very unique relationship. Please join me in welcoming Mark Katz.
Well, I'd like to thank Kate Seeley so very, very much for inviting me yet again to come speak at the Middle East Institute, which I think is a truly wonderful place. And I'm so glad that so many of you are here. And certainly the relationship between Moscow and Damascus, has gone back a long, long time. And we are now seeing the Russians, very strongly acting to defend the Assad regime. And I want to talk about why that might be. But before I do that, I want to say something about the history of the Syrian-Russian relationship. We certainly read in current press accounts about how strong the alliance has been between Russia and Syria, that Syria, is the last Russian ally in the Middle East. But to tell you the truth, the relationship between Russia and Syria, going back to the 1950s, has never been an easy one. There's always been problems in this relationship. That it first became close in the 1950s, especially with the rise of the Ba'ath regime. And it seemed that, what happened was that the Ba'ath, anti-Western, anti-Israeli, when they first came to power, they came to power in cooperation with the Syrian Communist Party. That Moscow seemed to have hopes that the Syrian Communist Party would at minimum share power with the Ba'ath indefinitely, if not take power. But of course the Ba'ath had other ideas, and it seems that part of the motive for joining Nasser in the United Arab Republic was to get Nasser's assistance in crushing the Syrian Communist Party, which he did very, very effectively. Then, of course, once he had done that, and the United Arab Republic broke up again in 1961, Russia reestablished relations with Syria, but for the next decade, or basically, the Soviet-Syrian relationship played second fiddle to the Soviet-Egyptian relationship. Egypt was the main Soviet ally in the region, where there were an even larger Soviet troop presence of Soviet naval bases in Egypt, and basically Egypt, which is usually at odds with Syria during this period. Russia certainly didn't do anything to side with Syria against Egypt. Now, the relationship got closer in the 1970s after the Egyptians expelled the Soviets. Then Syria's importance to Russia increased dramatically, and certainly with the Soviets being able to make use of the naval facility at Tartus, which is something that was very important for their Mediterranean fleet. But even then, there were still problems between Moscow and Damascus. It was one of the things that the Syrians complained about bitterly was that the Soviets did not provide the same quality of weaponry to Syria that the Americans supplied to Israel. And in the many clashes between Syrian and Israeli forces that took place, especially in Lebanon, Israel usually getting the best of it, Syria blamed Moscow. The Soviets made it clear that there was nothing wrong with the quality of their weaponry. It was the quality of the people who were operating them that was an issue. So that was an issue, in other words, that sort of they constantly chafed at this. In addition, the Soviets had very good relations with Iraq. Well, maybe not very good. As good as was possible, I suppose, with Saddam Hussein, which, of course, Syria and Iraq didn't get along at all. And so this was also a thorn in the side of the Soviet-Syrian relationship. And then one important difference was that while the Soviet Union, no matter how opposed to Israeli policy it may have been, has always recognized Israel as having a right to exist, whereas Syria has usually not been in this particular camp. And so Syria did not even cooperate with Soviet Middle East peace efforts for the most part. In other words, this was something that Syria was not particularly interested in. The relationship got cooler when Gorbachev came to power, especially as his administration started pursuing a new thinking, as they called it, in foreign policy. As Gorbachev improved relations with America and the West, improved relations with the moderate Arab governments, improved relations even with Israel, the Soviet-Syrian relationship took a back seat. And then in the 1990s, it basically fell into a torpor. In other words, that under Yeltsin in particular, there was very little content to the Russian-Syrian relationship. The Russian Navy even stopped using the facilities at Tartus. Russian Navy has had a hard time operating at all. Whereas in the United States, of the three services, the Navy may be sort of first among equals. In Russia, the Navy has always gotten a back seat compared to the Army and usually some of the other services as well. And so the Russian-Syrian relationship basically was in abeyance. When Putin came to office at the very end of 1999, he became president in his own right in 2000, he set about to reassert Russia's influence in much of the world where it had retreated, especially the Middle East, tried to revive the Russian-Syrian relationship. But it didn't revive at first. It took until about 2005. One of the things that Putin seemed to be quite serious about was collecting the debt that Moscow claims Syria owed to Moscow from the Soviet era, that this was, something on the order of $12 to $13 billion, that the Syrians, as so many Russian allies of the past, were sure that they didn't know anything near that much amount of money. And this was a real issue for Putin, at least for a while. Now, the relationship did improve in 2005. It seems that it was at this time when the U.S. still seemed to be doing well, not only in Afghanistan but even in Iraq. And there was talk about what country would we liberate next? Would it be Iran? Would it be Syria? And of course, there was the Cedar Revolution in Lebanon. Syrian troops withdrew from Lebanon, and the question was, would there be intervention? And this seems to have drawn the Russians and the Syrians together. The debt issue, they more or less got around basically on Syria's terms. I think the Russians wrote off something like 75% of the face value, and the rest, was converted into investments in Syrian industry, et cetera, et cetera. On the other hand, Russia did gain certain things, and that is that Syria might not have paid for past Soviet weapons, but they were now buying Russian weapons and actually paying for them. The Russian Navy started to renew its use of Tartus, and the Russian oil company Tatneft acquired interests in the Syrian petroleum sphere. So that's on the positive ledger. But on the negative ledger, some of the same old issues still seem to dog them, and that is that the Russians would sell weapons to Syria, but not the advanced weapons that the Syrians wanted, and that they seem to be holding off, not just at the behest of the United States, but at the behest of Israel. And this is one of the interesting aspects, I think, of Putin's Middle East policy that I think is often not understood in the U.S., but that under Putin in particular, Russian-Israeli relations have grown extremely close. And that especially with the conservative Israelis in particular, that there is a great deal of security cooperation between Russia and Israel. Trade relationship has boomed, that the addition of Israeli technology makes Russian arms sales to certain customers, particularly India, possible. I don't know that they'd even happen without this addition. They really aren't Russian arms sales. They're Russian/Israeli arms sales to India. And so all of this is, the Syrians have noticed and have been unhappy about. So, even if Assad crushed his enemies and they never rise again, it's very doubtful that Russian-Syrian relations going forward would be smooth and easy. In other words, that there have been so many issues between them in the past that it's very likely that they would rise again. In other words, Syria has not been an easy ally for Russia in the least. So why, then, is Moscow defending it so staunchly now? What are its motives? Now, one can certainly point to, well, they would lose, if Assad falls, they'd lose the arms sales, they'd lose Tartus, they'd lose the oil interests. But certainly, members of the Syrian National Council whom I've spoken to have indicated that they have been in talks with the Russians and have sought to reassure them that, in fact, they would like to, continue close Russian-Syrian cooperation. That, in other words, that all this is still possible if, if Russia wants and if it would stop supporting Assad so closely. Now, maybe one might doubt their promises, especially now that their ranks seem to be divided. But in other words, it seems to me that it would behoove Moscow to be a little more neutral in this. In other words, since it's not clear who is going to be the future government of Syria, why not hedge one's bets? In other words, so that whoever is in power, they can get along with. Why put all their eggs in the Assad basket, if you will, when doing so could be quite costly to them. And I don't think, in our terms, certainly the value of the arms sales is just peanuts, from our terms. And they have lots of, oil interests as well. In other words, that Syrian oil is not exactly going to, to make them. So what is it? And it seems to me that there are three three areas in particular that help explain Russian motives. And first and foremost is that the Russians really think that the Americans and Westerners in general fundamentally misunderstand what is going on in Syria or what can happen there. That this is not a democratic revolution by any means, and that if the Assad regime falls, that whatever comes afterward will be hostile to the West, will be hostile to Russia, and that essentially they feel that they have a far better understanding of what's going on in Syria than, say, the Obama administration, or at least their belief as what the Obama administration thinks about it, and that they don't have what they see as the Obama administration's rosy expectations of democratization. In other words, so change in government in Syria is not going to lead to democracy. It's not going to lead to something better. It's going to lead to something worse, and worse for everyone. And surely this is obvious. Another reason why the Russians seem to be so supportive of Syria is they don't really see a great cost in opposing the U.S. on this. That they, I think according to their lights, in fact, they don't see the U.S. as very serious about Syria. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to alliterate there, serious about Syria. Probably not the first one to do that. In that the Obama administration is essentially calling for UN Security Council economic sanctions against the Assad regime. Well, what the Russians understand is that economic sanctions work very slowly, if at all. I mean, the ones against Cuba are not exactly, still have yet to come to fruition. That if the U.S. was serious about change in Syria, that it would do what it always does, and that is assemble a coalition of the willing and militarily intervene and basically present the Russians with the choice of support us in the Security Council or not. We're going in. That the U.S. has a history, as does Russia, of acting outside of the UN Security Council. We've done it before, and they know we can do it again. Therefore, the fact that we're not doing it shows them that we really aren't serious. That by calling for economic sanctions, what they see the Obama administration as doing as attempting to be seen to do something about Syria, while in fact not doing anything. And that there are good reasons for the Obama administration not to do anything about Syria. One is that the Israeli government in particular has made clear that it does not see the possibility of change in Syria. It's not focusing on how things might be better. It's definitely focusing on how things might be worse. And that there are many, the Israelis see the downfall of the Assad regime, even though the Assad regime has clearly been no friend of Israel's, as harming Israel. In other words, that Israel is better off with the continuation of the Assad regime, and as the Russians understand, that the Israelis have some means to persuade American policymakers of their point of view. The other thing, of course, is simply American domestic politics. That Americans are weary of the wars that they have become engaged in this part of the world. They don't want another one. The Obama administration in particular doesn't want to see another war in an election year, and probably not afterwards. And that while the Republicans, or certain Republicans, might claim that they would be more inclined to intervene, that when it comes down to it, if we have a new Republican administration, that if anything, they're going to be more sensitive to Israeli concerns about Syria than the Obama administration is. So they don't see the American political system as calling for this. And if the Americans want to blame Russia for not being able to do anything about Syria, then that's actually good as far as Moscow is concerned, because that makes Russia look like it's powerful and important, even though it might not be. And so if we act like they are, then maybe they are. So I think that, in other words, they don't see us as the principal instigator, shall we say, and that's how they view it in Syria. And that brings me to the third motivation that the Russians have. In other words, that then if the U.S. is not really bringing about change in Syria, then who is? And they do have targets to blame, and this is Saudi Arabia in particular, as well as Qatar. Sort of, in other words, what they see is a grand Sunni effort to spread, Saudi influence, Sunni influence to Syria. Now, I want to back up just a little bit. It's a little over a decade ago, fall of 2001, the Middle East Institute's Michael Collins Dunn was kind enough to publish an article of mine in the Middle East Journal on the Saudi-Russian relationship, in which I talked about the really almost primordial fears that the Russians have of Saudi Arabia, that we tend to think of Saudi Arabia as a conservative power. The Russians back then thought of Saudi Arabia as a revolutionary power, that they blamed the problems they were experiencing in Chechnya and in the North Caucasus in general on Saudi action, Saudi support for Chechen rebels. They frequently claimed before 9/11 that in fact Saudi Arabia supported Al-Qaeda, and they regarded 9/11 as the chance to finally, pull the wool from America's eyes to see what the true nature of Saudi Arabia actually was. Now, of course, Russian-American relations would not be so good for so long, but you'll remember that during this brief period, especially late 2001, 2002, Putin himself never tired of reminding the world, and America in particular, that 15 of the 19 bombers came from Saudi Arabia. Well, you know what that means, don't you? That there was that Saudi Arabia is the enemy. So this was their view of Saudi Arabia, and that basically that they were intending to spread radical Sunni Islamism throughout the Middle East and throughout the Muslim world up into Russia as well as elsewhere in the former Soviet Union. Now, this changed in 2003 with the Saudi-Russian rapprochement, that as Russian-American relations deteriorated, Saudi-American relations were not so good at this point. It was actually an initiative of Crown Prince Abdullah in particular. He went to Moscow. This was the highest level Saudi visit to Russia ever. And basically, what the Saudis seemed to have convinced the Russians was that, in fact, they did not support the independence of these small, weak, violent states in the North Caucasus, that they were willing to accept the Russian solution for them. And in fact, the Saudis have done this almost too well. In other words, they have basically, welcomed the Kadyrovs, in other words, the former Chechen rebels with whom Putin cut a deal with to essentially run Chechnya for them. They can do anything they want, and they do, except for declare independence. That Ramzan Kadyrov, who in many respects, qualifies as a psychopath, who claims to have instituted Islamic rule in Chechnya, has been welcomed to Riyadh and accepted as a good Muslim leader, etc. It's really quite amazing. Anyway, the Saudi-Russian relationship seemed to take off. Putin himself visited Riyadh in 2007. He also visited Qatar and Jordan at that particular time. The Russians seemed to be hoping that there would be, Saudi resentment of the United States would lead to Russian arms sales to Saudi Arabia, Russian investments in the Saudi oil sector, gas sector, every sector you can imagine. They hope to build railroads in Saudi Arabia. It's really just their hopes just were amazing. And of course, there'd be Saudi investment in Russia. And it didn't quite come off this way. The Saudis made clear it was that their interpretation of one of the things that bothers Saudi Arabia, you may have heard, is Iran and the threat from Iran. And they're very unhappy that the Russians support the Iranian nuclear program as well as their sell weapons to them. The Saudi view of Russia's motives was that they were strictly commercial. In other words, that why were they selling arms to Iran? Well, because they didn't have many customers. Iran was one. The Saudi solution seemed to be that, well, we know how to deal with that. We'll buy far more than the Iranians are buying from you. You just stop selling to Iran, and we'll take up the slack and more. You'd think the Russians would accept that, but no, they did not. They don't want that. What they want to be able to do is to sell to everyone. What they want is not the Saudi solution, but the UAE solution. The UAE has issues with Iran. Russia sells arms to Iran. The UAE buys lots of arms from Iran. That's what they want the Saudis to also do. You have difficulties with your neighbors? You don't like that we sell arms to them? We'll sell arms to you too. And that would be their solution. The Saudis have not accepted that. Now, what has happened is that there has been sort of slowly over the past couple of years, it seems that whenever there's a Putin visit anywhere, that the initial expectation is, the Russian relations with this country are really now close. But in almost every case that he's visited the Middle East, what has happened is the opposite. That Putin came to visit, expectations ran high, and then they were never fulfilled. That in fact the relationship in fact tended to sour. But they have really soured now in the wake of the Arab Spring, or I guess Arab uprising. I'm not quite sure if there's a correct term for this. I know that some of my colleagues don't like the term Arab Spring, but anyway, it seems to be the popularly accepted terminology. That the Russians have come to the conclusion that Saudi Arabia, in particular, along with Qatar, is attempting to hijack the Arab Spring. And as evidence, they point to Saudi support on the Salafist Party in Egypt, which has done very, very well, Saudi support for Islamist allies in Libya, that the Saudis are very much involved in the solution that has been achieved in Yemen, but in Syria in particular, what they see as Saudi Arabia is attempting to take advantage of the unrest to bring down the Alawite minority regime allied to Iran, and to replace it with a regime that is beholden to Saudi Arabia, and that this is what they're doing. And the question is, do the Americans understand this or not? Now, Russian views of Saudi Arabia, we might argue, many of us might argue that in fact the Russians simply don't understand what Saudi Arabia, what its motives are or what it's trying to do. And then, I haven't even touched on the Russian-Qatar relationship, and this has been an extremely difficult relationship over the past several years. That Russia regards Qatar in particular as a competitor in the natural gas market, one in which Qatar has competitive advantages compared to Russia, and that it doesn't cooperate with at all. And the Qataris have reason not to like the Russians, especially when they assassinated, one of the former Chechen president on Qatari territory several years back. In any event, is their fear of Saudi Arabia rational? Is their characterization of what the Saudis are trying to achieve in Syria rational? Well, I guess the way I think to think about it is that this is what they think. It's not a question of whether it's accurate or not. And I think that the way to do it is that just as the United States tends to be very fearful of Iran, Russia does not. They don't see Iran as such a powerful state. They don't even see Iran, a nuclear Iran, as being that much of a problem. I mean, after all, it's not nearly as bad as a nuclear Pakistan, for God's sake. And that, nothing that that sort of it's the mirror image with regard to Saudi Arabia. Whereas the Russians regard Saudi Arabia as very threatening, we obviously don't. And just as the Russians are unlikely to ever be able to persuade us that Iran is not a threat, I don't think we're going to be able to persuade the Russians that Saudi Arabia is not a threat. And so, in other words, this is what they see is this geopolitical tectonic shift, if you will, that they have allied with many governments in the Middle East, which, although opposed to each other, most of them have been opposed to what they regard as radical Sunni fundamentalism. And then hence, in other words, they can be friends with both Iran and with Israel because they see both as enemies of these, the Ba'ath regime in Syria as well, and that the U.S., they see, is naively cooperating in the destruction of this order which has served us all so well for so long, and that it's going to be negative for all of us, but for Russia in particular. In other words, that Russia has, people of my age are used to thinking of it, as in the past as a revolutionary power, that in fact it has become an ultra-conservative state. That in many respects they regard Saudi Arabia as the revolutionary state, and the U.S., to the extent that they some days think we know what we're doing, they regard us as also revolutionary, but mostly they just think that we are ignorant. I'm not saying that view is accurate, but what I am saying is that is how they see it. Now, I think I have talked for long enough and hopefully given lots of food for conversation, so I hope that there'll be lots of questions and comments from the audience.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you for those interesting calculations about why Russia maintains its support for Syria. I think there are a lot of questions about this topic, a lot of people in this room who've been asking why Russia doesn't do more to pressure Syria. And in fact, Amal Moudallali, I know, has been very focused on this question. Amal, if you could please identify yourself and we'll have a microphone.
Hi, I'm sorry I came a little bit late. I don't know if you touched on the question, but I didn't hear you talk about the domestic Russian politics as one of the factors of supporting Syria, because I've been following this issue as I've been talking to my friend here about it, and I noticed a lot of fear in Russia, especially in Putin and his surroundings, that they might be next if this is allowed, and they create a precedence at the Security Council that when there is an internal opposition, that the Security Council and NATO are going to interfere, that maybe Russia will be next. How much you think this is a factor in the fear factor in Russia of interference in Russian affairs that causing them to do this, to support Syria to this extent?
Well, that is an interesting question, and certainly a little over a year ago when it appeared that the West was serious about intervening in Libya, Medvedev, who's always seemed to be the more reasonable, compared to Putin, indicated that it was all a Western plot to export color revolutions into the former Soviet Union, and that this was going to fail. And then, of course, we saw this past fall the eruption of remarkable demonstrations against Putin, in response to the parliamentary election results, and that there has been a lot of unrest. Now, I think though that the real question is, do the Russians see events in Syria or the Arab world in general as sort of linked to their own problems? And I have to admit, I'm just not so sure about this. That unfortunately, let's just put it this way: as we all know. Prejudice exists in this world. It's not a good thing. We should all condemn it, but it exists and we have to understand it. And I don't think that Russians in general see Arabs as a people who that they want to follow, shall we say. In other words, that if there is unrest in the Arab world, I'm not so sure that the Russians would see this as an opportunity for them. Partly because they don't see the Arabs as capable of democracy. They don't really believe in democracy to begin with, to tell you the truth. They do believe in the excitability of the masses. They believe that governments can fall in the heat of an aroused rabble, if you will, but that, whatever the slogans for democracy, democracy will not follow. And so I think that, what happened in Russia, I think there's domestic causes for that. In other words, had the Arab Spring not happened, I think we would have seen what's happening in Russia anyway. Maybe I'm wrong, I don't know. They are concerned, of course, about their own Muslims. But if anyone who's been to Russia, especially any Muslim who's been to Russia, knows, just Russian prejudice against Muslims is very serious and, very, very fierce. They're not really giving them much of a choice. So it's a hard thing to know what the balance actually is. How much they see the Arab Spring as a domestic threat, or how much of what's happening in Russia.
I didn't mean the Arab Spring. I meant the West interfering, using the internal situation in Russia to interfere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they definitely see this, but and they've said so, but it's kind of bizarre. I think it was Putin, a while ago, blamed, a signal from Hillary Clinton, led to the demonstrations, and sort of as many Russian, Muscovites indicated, well, gosh, they're still waiting for their money from Hillary. It's like, it's not as if the American Secretary of State can make a statement and that, Russians will rush madly out of their house to demonstrate against the regime. There are real domestic causes for what's happening there. That one of the things that helps Russia is the extraordinary xenophobia of most Russians that the Putin regime shares with much of the Russian public, and that in fact will make democratization difficult because it's seen somehow as being the influence of the West. We can't make people democratize. We can't do that. But certainly Putin likes, in other words, if he can portray that the opposition is somehow, his opposition is linked to the West, then he can delegitimize them.
Thank you, Melissa Maley, CNO Resources. The Soviet-Syrian relationship was managed primarily through intelligence and security channels. That was the strength of their relationship. It was not so much a politically driven relationship. And you talk about this, in 2003, 2004, change, revitalization of the relationship. And I'm wondering if the character of that relationship has not changed, because when I look at what you kind of gone through the rhetoric of what the Russians see happening in Syria today, what you're really hearing there is the storyline, the Syrian security storyline of what is the character, what is the alternative to the Assad regime, something worse. So you see that seems to be being channeled once again through this security relationship. And if you look at the future of Syrian security is so tightly linked to the regime now that if the regime goes down, they go down. And so they have no interest to characterize any source of vulnerability in their future in Russia when they're talking, their future in Syria when talking to their Russian counterparts. So if you could, I'm very interested in if you think there's been a change in that character of that relationship that has moved to different channels.
No, I think that it's the same, group. It's obviously the Russian Navy, the Russian arms industry, the Russian security services, and that these are the main actors. Now, on the other hand, some of these actors that want to preserve the Russian-Syrian relationship are also some of the same actors that want to preserve the Russian-Israeli relationship. In other words, that here in Washington we tend to think of people as being either pro-Israeli or pro-Arab. In Moscow, you can be both. That there is an Israeli lobby, there is an Iranian lobby, there is an Arab lobby, and some of the characters involved in any one are involved in the others. It's very different from here in that sense. On the other hand, I mean, look who's powerful in Russia. It's the security services. Who does Putin draw his support from? It's this type of individual, this type of mentality. So yeah, they're definitely on the same wavelength as the people in Syria. And because other than that, there isn't much contact between Russian and Syrian societies, unlike contact between Russia and Israel. I think that it was in late 2009 where the number of Russian tourists visiting Israel exceeded the number of American tourists visiting Israel. That there's over 1 million Russian speakers in Israel. There's a tremendous amount of there's a vibrant Russian media in Israel. There's a tremendous amount of of contact on a societal level between these two countries. It's a very different kind of relationship than the one between Russia and Syria.
Jill Doherty from CNN. Mark, I wanted to ask you, there's a theory now kind of in Moscow, which is actually pretty simple, which says, forget about the history. It's the principle of the thing. The Russians would say, you did this in Libya. You changed a government under the cover of an air attack. You got rid of Gaddafi. And you want to do that in Syria. And potentially, by maybe even criticizing the election of Putin very gently, but you might delegitimize our leader, and therefore you might want to, we don't think he would invade, but you never know. You yourself said they look upon the U.S. as kind of revolutionary. But I mean, do you see that theory as something almost an easier explanation for why they stick, that it's the principle of it?
Well, it's very interesting because before coming here today, I was participated in a teleconference at RIA Novosti's headquarters. There were 4 Americans and 3 Russians, and we were exchanging views, and they brought this exact thing up, that Russia stands for the principle of non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries. Now, of course, it's really, of course, except for Georgia, except for their immediate, neighbors. That's different somehow or other. But that this is what they claim to be that they are doing. What happened in Libya, they're very upset about. But I cannot believe that they didn't know what was going to happen. In other words, they themselves seem to acknowledge, at least some of their commentators, that it didn't matter if they had abstained from the resolution. Had they vetoed it, the U.S. would have gone in anyway. And I think the same is true with regard to Syria. They know that ultimately they can't stop us if we want to go in. And that, I think, is what's really frustrating for them, is that they know we can do it. But what they know is that the Obama administration doesn't want to go in. And so they are, exploiting this to the extent they can. That it's the it's the Saudi Arabia, Qatar, their calls for intervention that make them fearful. Because after all, it was when they did so with regard to Libya that the U.S. tended to get serious. Could this happen again? So I think that this whole question of you fooled us last year, we're not going to let you fool us again. They ultimately know that we're not dependent upon them. So I think that basically is something they understand. I'm not sure if I answered your question, though. Okay, good.
Gentleman in the back here.
Robert Werthmuller. Thank you. Hudson Institute. First of all, for those of us who spend most of our time on the Middle Eastern side of things, it's very difficult to read some of these major international players, so I appreciate the context that you've given to us in this. Bringing that up to sort of immediate context, has there been any subtle shift that's easy to miss in terms of the way that Russia is addressing the situation in terms of how it's being broached in the UN and such? And if not, do you think that there's any possibility that Russia will shift its position in terms of Syria in the months to come?
Well, that's a very good question because it seemed that this past Saturday, with this meeting, with Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov, meeting in Cairo with the Arab League foreign ministers, that all of a sudden they're in accord. In other words, that they agreed to a 5-point program with regard to Syria involving, immediate ceasefire, support for humanitarian efforts, monitoring, support for the Kofi Annan mission, and most importantly, no external intervention or interference in Syria. Okay, so we achieve this, or this agreement has been achieved. Then what happens in the next couple of days? Qatar calls for Arab intervention in Syria, and the Russians themselves announce that they will continue selling arms to Syria. Now, of course, they say these weapons aren't being used against the Syrian people. These are for national defense against external enemies. But in any event, in other words, that the agreement doesn't seem to have done anything, and sort of what was the whole point? And there's actually a very interesting article by a seasoned Russian commentator. It's the female Russian journalists who are the best at this, Yelena Suponina, and she talks about what happened in Cairo, and that basically what she's Al-Sharq al-Awsat has said that the Russians gave in to the Arabs, that they agreed that Assad has to leave, whereas the Russian media is reporting that the Arabs gave in to Russia, and that probably what really happened was nothing. That I think what the Russians do understand, and the importance of the Cairo meeting, was that they may be understanding that they have not done themselves any favors in supporting Syria so strongly when so much of the Arab world is concerned about Syria and calling for intervention, and so that they need to mend fences. But I also think that the Russians have this notion, they really do think they're a great power, that they'll come and explain things to the Arabs, and that the Arabs will then see the light and will work with them. And of course, it so far hasn't quite worked out that way. Now, what will change Russia? What I think is that if one really wants to be cynical, one might say that, well, in fact, even if Assad falls, and they assign that a low probability, even if Assad falls, Russian support for him won't cost Russia because, of course, the new government that comes to power in Syria will need good relations with Russia. Russia is, after all, a permanent member of the Security Council. They will need, Russian support there. In other words, that people will have to come to Russia no matter what. And so they can afford now to, that being the case, then they have nothing to lose by standing up for the principle of non-intervention in internal affairs. So, what would actually change them? I think that, as with Libya, now I guess in Libya, they were with Gaddafi almost to the bitter end. I think it was in last June that they sent Senator Margalov, the head of their the Upper House Foreign Relations Committee, that he went to Libya and spoke both with the regime and then went to Benghazi and spoke with the rebels, and that was amazing. That they had treated them as more or less equal. The Russians have been talking with the Syrian National Council all along. In other words, they've been doing that. And this has been publicized. So I think that they don't assign it a high probability, but that if these are the future government, that they'll somehow be able to pull it off. Whether that's realistic or not is another issue.
And certainly they must be worried watching their ally Assad handle this conflict a year into it. We see no near solution, no resolution. And the question, of course, is how much influence does Russia have over Syria to help them through a soft landing? Can Russia encourage the Assads to perhaps step down, hand over power to Farouk to maintain the basic structures of the Syrian regime in order for there not to be a complete implosion? Do you think the Russians have that kind of influence, or might they go this way?
No, I think that there is. We were talking about ahead of time, like, why not a Yemen solution to what's happening in Syria? In other words, hand over power to the vice president, and sort of, get the top guy out, sort of share power supposedly with the opposition. It strikes me that Bashar al-Assad is not Ali Abdullah Saleh. Ali Abdullah Saleh, it's not clear to me that he's really given up power. He's just a lot.
The Assads might like something.
That's right, but that they can't play ball. They can't even pretend to give up power. In other words, that it's just too, they're not Yemenis. They're different. And we have seen, like, Lavrov did issue some criticism of Assad that they weren't following Russian advice about needed reforms, etc. Although, at this point, I remember the Jean Kirkpatrick article and commentary talking about criticizing the Carter administration for calling for our beleaguered right-wing allies to initiate reform when they're fighting for their lives. And so I think that we're not going to see al-Assad carry out meaningful reforms at present. That I think he would only see that as anything meaningful would weaken him. Maybe some non-meaningful reform, but no one's going to be fooled by that. So I think that the frustrating thing for Russia is that they have so little leverage, and this is, a complaint they have with regard to pretty much everything, that they want so much to be seen as a great power, accepted as a great power, but when it comes down to it, not only does the United States basically ignore Russia, but everyone else does too. That no one really is like worrying about, what's Russia going to do or say, and that they're just not a factor. But they sure are going to be affected by whatever happens in Syria.
Hi, I'm Tatiana Indina, Cannon Institute, Wilson Center. Well, Mark, I have a more general question. So can you please give your opinion or any prognosis on how will Russian-American relations develop after this new term of Vladimir Putin? So we have a third term already, right? So how can you prognose the development of Russian-American relations?
I don't think it's going to improve. I just think that Putin, has a increasingly negative and embittered attitude toward the United States. The Russian press even derided this American idea that, things will get better after the election. That Putin has to be anti-American during the election, but things will be better. And that they issued a statement indicating that, unlike America and some other Western countries, their foreign policy doesn't follow electoral cycles, that it doesn't change after elections. They thought this was a good thing, that they don't have to be concerned about public opinion, apparently. But no, I think that I don't see anything that is likely to improve Russian-American relations. And to me, what's remarkable is that President Obama's new ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul, who was one of the great American specialists on Russia and Russian-American relations, there is no stronger advocate of improved Russian-American relations than Michael McFaul. And look how badly they have treated him in Moscow, and especially, almost like claiming he's there to overthrow their government. And, it's very upsetting to them that he talks to lots and lots of people, etc. So if they're not, it takes two to tango, and I think that the Obama administration, whether it was a good idea or not, I'll let you decide. But the Obama administration, I think, wanted good relations with Russia partly because it wanted Russian cooperation in the Middle East, with Iran in particular. But there were other issues that we wanted and hoped for Russian cooperation on, and we haven't gotten it. And in fact, they seem quite proud that they're not giving it to us. So I don't see that changing unless and until they feel much more threatened than they are now, and they need us for whatever reason.
I just would like to get your explanation. Why do you think there is no debate inside Russia on the Syrian situation? Because I didn't see any voices. Even when you looked at the presidential candidates against Putin, they were all supportive of the policy. And you don't see like intellectual debate on Syria and people saying this is right or wrong. What's your explanation?
Well, my explanation is that it boils down to prejudice, that Russians in general have a very negative view of Arabs, and that they don't see Arabs as capable of democracy or of doing anything good for the rest of us. And that therefore, and that if the Americans think so, it's just another example of American naivete. Polls show, that something like 60% of the Russian public, at least, supports the Russian government's position on Syria. In other words, they don't see democracy as an outcome of the Arab Spring.
Yeah, how's that playing in the Russian press? Are they seeing these images? Are they seeing the images of dead and tortured?
There's a callousness. There's a callousness with regard to this sort of thing. They're not impressed. That basically, I think that if you said this to them, their argument would be that, well, a lot more would die if the opposition comes to power. In other words, that the Syrian opposition is a fundamentalist organization. This morning at RIA Novosti, one of the leading Russian experts, this guy Yevgeny Satanovsky, head of this pro-Israeli but anti-American think tank in Russia, that he basically accused the United States of being allied with Al-Qaeda in Syria. Now, by Al-Qaeda, when Russians say that, what they really mean is Saudi Arabia. And, sort of the American respondents were that, this is just nuts. But you cannot convince them otherwise, that they really think, and it goes back to all these different things. In other words, that this is just like Afghanistan when we were there trying to, establish a progressive order, and you supported people like bin Laden against us, and look what it got you. It bit you, didn't it? And this is the exact same thing is going to happen to you with regard to Syria, but you keep on doing it, don't you? So this is what they see. In other words, whatever bad is happening in Syria, it will be worse otherwise. That's how they see it.
Yes, well, clearly they have a very jaundiced view of the region and of
pessimistic,
the potential for democracy in the region. And on that note, I think we'll end. We'll certainly be watching the Russian calculations vis-a-vis Syria and hoping they do change their position as the regime starts to crumble, if in fact it does.
Yes.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking Mark Katz. That's just the Russian character. I mean, extremely pessimistic about everything.